everyone, welcome back to the Facts of Life lecture series. We are going to start now to talk about behavioral ecology, which was historically known as animal behavior, and still is sometimes called animal behavior. So we'll talk about how people have been thinking about the ways animals behave since we first started writing. We'll talk about sexual selection and also some experimental approaches to understanding the behaviors of animals. So I told you that behavioral ecology has become a term that is a little more preferred by modern behaviorists for understanding the behaviors of a diversity of organisms, not just animals. And here's an explanation of this framework. You can see in these three circles, we have the mechanisms of a behavior, the ecological context of behavior, and the evolutionary biology of the behavior. So in terms of mechanisms, we have things like genetics, physiology, and development. Ecological context includes how populations change, how ecological dynamics across landscapes vary, and also community structure, things like diversity and conservation. So the kind of threats that animals face will affect their behaviors. And of course, evolutionary biology are things like natural selection and sexual selection. And also there's some non-adaptive selection that occurs. In any case, all of these circles have been kind of siloed for most of the history of their study, but we know that they interact with each other in various different ways. And modern behavioral ecology is this interdisciplinary field that seeks to study those circles and the interplay among all of them. And I told you in the first slide that some of the earliest records of human writing, including cave drawings, were people depicting animal behaviors. So we've been fascinated by the behaviors of animals. We've had a lot of our own survival depend on the behaviors of animals for much of our history as a species. And across really different cultures, people have been fascinated and affected by the behaviors of the animals that lived among them. And that's why we see so many of these different cultures depicting the behaviors of animals. But of course, Aristotle was one of the first people to move beyond description to try to think in a more scientific way about the ways that animals behave. And most of his writings focused on humans, and so some of you are majors that have that Aristotle has a lot more to say about, and it has a stronger effect on. But he did think about behaviors exhibited by animals, and one thing that he thought about was that these behaviors are evidence that animals are closer to humans than other organisms. So that gets back to thinking about evolution before we really had a theory of evolution. His thoughts about the behaviors of human and non-human behaviors included predictions about the mechanisms that could underlie these behaviors, which we still study, but he didn't think about behavior in a really quantitative way. So he was just really describing or trying to think about relationships as he described. So we're moving beyond description, but not actually measuring things. So this is his idea of the development of thought. So plants have this vegetative soul. All they're really able to do is reproduce and grow. Animals have a sensitive soul, meaning that they're able to move and they can feel things. Humans, though, they have a rational soul, so they're capable of thought and reflection. So he saw this progression. And he even took it further by thinking about what it means to be alive. What's a being versus a non-being? And so for him, the realm of being starts with man and then goes to demons, angels, and God. Um, and then the realm of becoming starts at minerals and goes to plants, animals, and man. So we obviously think about life in a really different way now, but this is an early attempt to try to understand relationships among different organisms and think about it in the way that behaviors might influence them. And so one thing that he said was mothers are fonder than fathers of their children because they are more certain they are their own. So without knowing about genetics, he's already thinking about things like passing on genetic information. Uh, all human actions have one or more of these causes: chance, nature, compulsions, habit, reason, passion, or desire. So again, mostly focused on humans, but he's trying to think about an explanation for behaviors. Okay, so let's move on. If there we go. To using a scientific experimental approach to understanding animal behaviors. And these three men, Karl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen, together got a Nobel Prize for their work in elucidating mechanisms of animal behavior. So Karl von Frisch studied honeybees, and a quote from him is, "A bee's life is like a magic well. The more you draw from it, the more it fills with water." So he worked out a lot of details about the biology of bees. Konrad Lorenz is famous for his work on imprinting, and he said, "In nature we find not only that which is expedient, but also everything which is not so inexpedient as to endanger the existence of the species." So there was this idea at the time that everything is tending towards efficiency. And he showed that that's not necessarily true, that there's plenty of behaviors of biology in nature that isn't the most efficient way possible. But if we think about this with an adaptive framework, then we can understand why that might be. And then Nico Tinbergen has this quote, "The behavior of animals puzzles many of us even more than our own behavior. And this is the basic question: what causes the innate and yet so effective behavior of animals?" Later in his life, he thought more about how much of that is innate versus learned. But yeah, it's true. Some of the behaviors of animals are much more perplexing than those of humans. Okay, so let's start with Karl von Frisch. Like I said, he did a lot of work to understand a lot of aspects of honeybee biology. But one thing he discovered was their ability to use dancing to communicate directions. So you can watch the video showing how they do this. I put a link in Canvas. You can also follow this URL if you just want to watch it directly. But by simply dancing when they return to the nest, the hive with food, they share information about how far away that food is, the direction to the food source relative to the hive, but not just the hive, also the sun. So they're triangulating where the food is. And they're able to make corrections in their dance for time of day. So that if when they were at a food source, it's later in the day, they will adjust by the time they get back to the colony, which is pretty cool. Okay, as I said, Konrad Lorenz became most famous for his behavioral imprinting experiments. So he did this imprinting with goslings. So as a control, we have the goslings and mother goose. So they're imprinted, meaning they have learned very early in their life to follow what their mother does. And so what Lorenz did was he raised them in an incubator and imprinted them to himself. So these gosling learned that he was their mother, essentially. So he would have them following him like a mother goose. And again, there's another video on the modules page of Canvas, but it's also, the URL is also here. You can watch it there, where you can see the various ways that he imprinted geese to think of him and follow his behaviors. So there are three main characteristics of imprinting according to Lorentz. First, it occurs very rapidly, so the actual training is fast. Second, it occurs only in a very limited part of the animal's life, so you have to get the right timing. Three, it's irreversible, or at least it's very hard to extinguish, meaning that once an animal is imprinted, it's almost impossible to erase that imprinting. So after his initial work, other people have, of course, studied imprinting, and they have actually identified the ideal conditions for effective imprinting. And they did this using, one study used these male models. So this is a male duck, not a female duck. And they used different distances and different ages of the chicks to see if they could get the baby ducks to imprint to the males instead of the females, which they normally would follow their mother. And so one thing that's found is that if we look at the age in hours when the imprinting occurs, there is a very tight peak here, just like Konrad Lorenz said, where if we look at the percent of perfect scores, meaning that every time the imprinting worked, it's most effective in this for ducks in this 13 to 16 hour range. And they did this for chicks as well, so ducklings and chicks. And yeah, so that's that second point, that timing is really important. The last one of these experimental godfathers of animal behavior is Nico Tinbergen. And his contribution was to give us a framework for thinking about the behaviors of animals. It was in 4 questions. What is the physiological causation of the behavior? How does the behavior develop in the individual? What is the function or survival value? So really the adaptive significance of the behavior. And how did the behavior evolve? If you're able to address all 4 of these questions, then you can understand a behavior quite well. And in the next lecture, I'm going to go over an example of how these questions can be applied to a specific animal behavior. Okay, but with that, I will say goodbye. If you have any questions, please use the discussions tab of Canvas to ask them. If you see someone else's question and you think you can help, please do so. As always, I will be available in my WebEx room during my office hours, but you can email me if you want to talk at a different time. And thank you for your attention. Bye.